decision if they would come up with an escape route. And my grandfather found somebody, he thought, who would help them to escape. They found safe housing, a hiding place for my grandmother. They thought it would be safe hiding. And they took off for Switzerland. Didn't go all that well. Here she is to tell you about that.
We were told that we would go to the taken care of. It was totally crooked. It was somebody who took all the money and saw to it that we were all put in prison. That the station where we went in, we were picked up in Venlo, that is at the border, and we were sent to the camp in prison in Cologne. And from there, I was transported, we were transported to Berlin, and that used to be an old people retirement home, and there they put all the Jews in, and from there they put us on the train to Auschwitz.
So she's 15 years old. They start in Amsterdam. By this time, she knows exactly what's going on. So does her brother, who's a couple of years older. They're shooting to go to Switzerland. You'll see it in red down below, to the south. They get to the border at Venlo. They get picked up, transported to Cologne, to Berlin, and then to Auschwitz. Did they know where they were going? No. Did they know it was going to be bad? Yes. Did they know how bad? I don't think so. Here she is.
We were put in cattle cars. Till the train stopped, and it was in Auschwitz. When we came out of the train, we were put separate. The men on this side, the women on that side. A doctor was looking at you, and he went like that. And one went to the camp, and the other one went to the gas chambers, but we didn't know that.
This is what that looked like. This is a group of Jews who came in later from Hungary, about a year after my mom arrived. But you see, the process was the same. Men on one side, the women on the other side. They are basically, if you were a woman with children, you got sent to the gas chamber. So on the right, look at those little faces of the little kids. That's a crime. In any event, those who did not go to the gas chamber were sent because it was believed that they were strong enough to work, were sent to the camp. The minute they arrived in the camp, their heads were shaved. They were told to strip and were doused against any kind of lice or whatever they might have picked up on the damn cattle car, pardon my French. They were then branded. Today we call it a tattoo, and it's kind of cool to be tattooed, but it sure wasn't in those days. You got a number on your forearm, and from then on, that was the number that you go by. All these years later, just 2 years ago, I said, "Mom, do you remember your number?" And she still remembered her number. That's how strong these memories are. They were given striped pajamas, whatever shoes they could find that fit or didn't fit, and they were put to work. Auschwitz-Birkenau was the largest and perhaps the worst, but I don't know how you compare these things. Certainly the largest concentration camp of its kind. It was both a concentration camp and an extermination camp. My mom arrived there at age 15, excuse me, April 20th, 1943. She stayed until January 18th, which is when another phase began, and it's the date that anybody who was in that camp remembers vividly. And in the end, she got lucky in that she was assigned to work in a laundry. She called it a laundromat because she's a little nervous talking. But you're going to see in this next set of clips that you're going to see, you'll notice that she comes alive. She's been nervous and not wanting to talk up to now, and now you're going to see a change in her mood. So here she is.
I worked in the laundry. So you had a laundry, you had the nähstube, the room where you had to be sewing, but they had to fix everything. And then the room where they would do the ironing, all for the Nazi uniforms. So I worked where we had to do the washing. And there's a big wooden things like that, and we standing. And then we had a washing board, and you washed. And then after that, you put it somewhere else, and then it was going in the room where it would be dried, and from there it went to the room where it would be fixed. And when we were washing, we tore it, because that would be work for the people who had to fix it. You know, so you did things, but whatever you could.
And of course, when she says that would be work for the people, that means that would be another day of life for somebody else. So you did what you could.
I did it because everything you can do to damage anything that belonged to the Germans, you do.
And then how did she survive? The Dutch, she says on the video, she doesn't, not on this clip, but she said it elsewhere, that the Dutch were not very well regarded in the camps. I'm not quite sure why, but certainly most of the Dutch Jews coming in were middle class, lower middle class, but they were perhaps not all that feisty in taking care of themselves in the streets. And certainly in Holland, there had not been pogroms the way that there had been in Eastern Europe. So part of what, well, for instance, I hadn't planned to tell you this, but her mother died within 2 weeks, and apparently that was my grandmother, and apparently that was standard. The Dutch died within 2 weeks of arriving in the camp. Somehow, she managed to survive.
The Polish Jews have been prosecuted for years, so they had more skills how to handle it and what you could do. I mean, I won't say it was foolproof, but they survived comparatively much better. And the reason I survived was because I was in that laundromat. That was a building, it was downstairs, comparatively to Auschwitz and Birkenau, it was luxury.
Of course, I don't want to be in that position of having to compare, but it's what allowed her to survive. The other thing she always says is that she survived just because of dumb luck, stom geluk in Dutch. She says, you know, it had nothing to do with anything that you did. You just happened to be lucky or not. In any event, almost 2 years in, the war is changing. The Allies have landed in the west of Normandy. My father is going to be part of that landing, but we'll get to him in a few minutes. And they were starting to make headway. On the east, the Soviets were coming closer. They were approaching rapidly. It was becoming rather obvious to many in the German system that they might lose this war. And they decided that it would not be a good thing to get caught by the enemy with all of these people who were clearly starving and emaciated and mistreated and abused, to have that be found by either the Allies or the Soviets. And so they decided to move all the prisoners to evacuate them. And this happened on January 18th. Get them out of Poland, get them back into Germany, where there's a chance that we can hide the evidence a little bit better. These marches ended up being called the death marches by the prisoners because if you didn't make it, you got shot. If you fell down, they didn't bother to shoot you. About 1 out of 3 on these death marches didn't make it. By the time that, and the way these they call them death marches, in part it was walking, in part they were also put on cattle cars. You may remember that earlier she said that when she was transported to Auschwitz, those cattle cars had been closed. These were not. And in addition, this is January 1945. Eastern Europe gets colder than Western Europe anyway, but this was the coldest winter on record. Record-breaking temperatures. In Holland, they were starving and freezing. In the East, it was terrible. So this, from every account that I've ever heard from people who have been there, was even worse than everything that preceded. And of course, you ask yourself before this starts happening, do I stay? my mom tells me that they did ask me, should we stay, should we go? And in the end, she decided to go. And it's probably a good thing because most of those who stayed behind were shot. In any event, the march went on, and they went from Auschwitz-Birkenau to Ravensbrück. Ravensbrück had been a concentration camp for women. I think at this point they took whatever they just put everybody in there. And at this point, by this time, my mother is not only emaciated, she's exhausted. She's just been on this forced march. She weighs 65 pounds, and she's about my height, 5'5". So you can imagine 65 pounds. And she no longer has an indoor job. She now has to work outside on the farm, I think. She said she remembers holding a rake, and she couldn't hold the rake in her hand. So she knew she was not going to this work. That's what happened. People knew when they were about to die. So she said she was close. She was days away from dying. And out of the blue, now she didn't see this, but we're showing it to you anyway. Out of the blue, she gets put into a white bus, one of 350 that arrived from Sweden, organized by a member of the Swedish nobility, who had originally gone into another camp, Bergen-Belsen, and saved a number of Danish and other women from that camp. He got about 11,000 people out and decided that he would do it again. He negotiated with Himmler. I forget what it is that he got in exchange, but he got the negotiation through. And sometime in January, shortly after my mother had arrived in Ravensbrück, these buses arrived, and they had big red crosses on the top of them so that they might not get bombed, because the Allies were flying overhead all the time. But in any event, my mom got put on one of these buses and went from Ravensbrück by bus to Lübeck in Germany, and then by boat to Malmö in Switzerland, and then a last little piece up the coast to a little place called Skattas. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, because Swedish is not one of my languages. In any event, you know how I mentioned that my mother never talked about Auschwitz? She, after the war, could not stop talking about Sweden. Sweden was wonderful. She had enough to eat. They put her in a cabin with 7 other Dutch women. Now, I forgot to mention earlier that in addition to everything else that happened when she arrived in Auschwitz, she lost her language. That is, there was nobody with whom to speak Dutch after her mother was gone. And so for the next almost 2 years, she had to speak German. That was the vehicular language. Interestingly enough, after she came out, she never, ever was willing to speak German again. But here she is in Sweden. She's arrived at 65 pounds. They start to gradually build up her strength. She's got women to hang out with. She remembers this as one of the most wonderful times in the world. And then in June, the ladies have all recuperated sufficiently that they are put on an airplane and they go back to Holland. My mom at this point is 17 years old. You see her there on the left. She looks pretty much a normal weight. She's going to go back to Holland. Holland, meanwhile, has had a pretty rough war as well. Even if you weren't Jewish, it was no picnic. And in particular, the last winter became known later as the hunger winter. The Dutch were having to go out and eat tulip bulbs. There was no food. All the food that was available from the farms, the Germans were shipping out. By this time, the Germans no longer believed that the Dutch should be treated like fellow Aryans. They were pissed at the Dutch, and they were going to punish them because the resistance had been very slow to start up, but there had been a significant enough resistance that things were happening to upset the Germans, let's say. So my mother came back to a country that was traumatized and that really wasn't all that interested, from what she says, of hearing her stories of trauma. So she didn't talk about it very much. It was difficult, obviously, to integrate back into daily life. What do you do when you first come back? First, you find a place to live. She was offered through the Jewish organizations, and she was technically a minor. She was 17 years old. It was suggested that she should move in with a family who would be willing to receive her, and she said, nope, no way. I have been I have managed on my own just fine, thank you very much, all this time. I don't need somebody to take care of me. I just need a room that I can live in. Because another thing, see, yeah, I forgot to mention this. Auschwitz, one of the things about it that isn't often mentioned, people often talk about how hungry everybody was, and thirsty for that matter as well. But in addition, it smelled terrible. It was noisy, and you never, ever had a moment of privacy. So my mother craved being by herself. And had the word or the concept existed in those days, we would now have called her an emancipated minor. She found a room, she found a place to live. The next thing was to do something about education. She hadn't been in school since she was 15. You can't get anywhere in life without a high school education. You guys are about 15, I assume, 14, 15. So you know that you've got to have a high school education if you want to do something with your life. And she knew that. But she no longer fit into the standard Dutch schools. So the Jewish community came to the rescue. They organized special schools for kids like my mom, who had needed to get an education but was not going to fit into the standard Dutch educational system. And she attended a school. What they did is it's like an AP program on steroids, if you will, 2 years in one. And she only needed the 2 years, so she was able to go for 1 year. She got her high school diploma. And then the next thing to do is to start searching for relatives, because who's left? Who's coming home? You want to know. So everybody is engaged in searching and looking, and the Red Cross is putting up lists every day. And people are skipping class because they want to find out if maybe their mother has come back. And nobody knows anything, and it's a very, very chaotic time. So this is where, no, one more slide first. It's a chaotic time, and of course the Dutch were slowly coming back. The Dutch did not fare very well in this whole experience. The Dutch Jews, that is. There were originally 140,000 Dutch Jews in Holland. 107,000 of them were murdered in the camps, Auschwitz mostly, and Sobibor in Poland. 5,200 people came back from the camps. My mom was one of them. The people who went into hiding did a little better. 2 out of 3 of the people who went into hiding survived. Anne Frank did not. My mother's cousin Annette did. And she died a few years ago with her husband, and their son are on this call from the Netherlands. So, as I said, everybody is trying to find everybody. They're all over. The place is in chaos, but they at least are free. The war is over. And at this point, I'd like to introduce to you my father. This is not his story, but he's my dad, so obviously he is part of the story, and he was also Dutch and Jewish. A bit older than my mom, 12 years older. And if you remember that picture of Rotterdam being bombed right at the beginning of this presentation, my father lived in Rotterdam at that point. He was already 24 years old. He had studied law at the University of Leiden in Holland, and he was starting to do work and do some other things. He also had been very active in the Boy Scouts and was a volunteer with the Boy Scouts. And through all of these activities, he had a very widespread network. And when it became clear that he would have to leave, he did 2 things. First, he and his brother, whose children are on this call, put their mother, my other grandmother, my paternal grandmother, Helene, in hiding. It didn't work out, they couldn't know that. And then my father, with the help of the resistance, the Dutch resistance, first went into hiding in the south of Holland, in Eindhoven. Incidentally, my family met that family a few years back when we were in Holland, and that was very special. My father hid out with his family in Eindhoven for 6 weeks, and then the resistance was ready for him, and they let him. He basically went on foot through France, through Belgium, through France, over the Pyrenees Mountains, and those are not shabby mountains, over into Spain, Portugal, and there he got a boat, and he joined the government in exile in England and joined the armed forces, the Dutch brigade of the British Armed Forces. One of the things that he did while he was there, so then, I'm sorry, So he was in the landing, not in June, but in August. And then at the liberation of Holland, he came back home to Rotterdam. And he began working for the Dutch administration, who were looking in all of this chaos. They were looking for people. They were also looking for property that had been looted and stolen. And my father became part of the brigade that was involved with that work. And working together with his cousin, incidentally, whose son is on this phone call today from France. It's pretty exciting to have all these folks with us here. In any event, they, at Liberation, as part of his work, he had a list of 52 names to find, to look up. The first 51 of those names didn't make it. My mother did. And here she is on her wedding day. They got married. They started a family. You see me in all my glory there with both of my parents. And 2.5 years in, for a number of reasons, my parents decided it was time to leave Europe. They wanted to leave all along, but it was the timing was such that they felt they needed to do it right then and there. My father's brother went with them and his family, and we went to a place you'd never guess in the Caribbean called Curacao. Why Curacao? Because it's a Dutch territory, which meant that my father would be able to find work there. While we waited for the visa, we, incidentally, I have to tell you, Curacao was a wonderful place to grow up. My family, my mother didn't like, the way my mother felt about Sweden is how I felt about Curacao. It's great. In any event, the visa came through. We left Curacao. We went up to New York by boat, and then we flew across the country to a city that some of you may be familiar with, Seattle, Washington. And we started a new life right before Halloween, 1956. I was 9 years old, same age that my mother had been when she moved to Amsterdam. We settled in. We had to learn English. My parents spoke English. My mother spoke schoolgirl English. My father spoke good English. He worked in Britain after all. My father worked during the day and got himself a degree as a CPA, certified public accountant. My mother was a house mother. She took care of us, did it very well, was very active. And eventually, about the same time that I enrolled at the UW, University of Washington, where I got a degree, my mother decided she wanted to get a degree, and she enrolled at that same university at the same time and got herself a BA in sociology. During that time, incidentally, she wrote a paper that is available through the Holocaust Center, and it is quite brilliant. This is for somebody who wouldn't talk about what she had experienced, but she talked about what it had been like. It's called Planned Deviant Behavior, and what it was like to go into the camps, and how you had to change your behavior in order to adapt, and what it was like when you came out of the camps, and that you then had to totally readapt as well. So life continued in the Pacific Northwest. It was a good one. All three of their children grew up. I went traveling. My other siblings stayed pretty much closer to home. And 2 years ago, as I said, I decided to tell this story. Why? Because we're living in scary times. And because these stories need to get out. I know you've all read history. We all have. I can't tell you how many books I've read, not just history, but personal accounts. You know, they say, jokingly, you can take the boy out of New York. You can't take New York out of the boy. You can take the survivors out of Auschwitz. I don't know that you can take Auschwitz out of the survivors. And sadly enough, it's a reality that gets transmitted. It's called epigenetics. So that although I was never in Auschwitz, Auschwitz is in me. But I think it's important to bring that history to life, to make it real. These are real people to know what's happened. Today, our country is going through a number of crises. That too is happening to real people. So my mother wouldn't talk about it. I'm so thrilled she's finally willing to put herself on video, give us this opportunity to meet her here together. And I can't tell you really how proud I am to tell this story. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you for being here. And I hope we have enough time to ask lots of questions. Julia, how do I turn this back over to you? Will you simply take it?
I'm back, and I thank you so much, Ina. we do have a couple questions that came in. I think I'm going to stop sharing the screen so we can see you more clearly when you're answering questions. All right, so let me just review the chat a little bit. And if you think of things in the next couple minutes, please do go ahead and type in the questions. But the first one that we have is about your father. And the question is whether he spoke openly about the war.
My father didn't really speak openly about the war, no. But he did tell stories sometimes. And I remember when I went on my first trip ever to Europe, I was going to work for the summer in Holland. I was 19 years old. I was so excited, and then I was going to go all over and backpack and do whatever I could. Hitchhike. I probably shouldn't say that to high school students, but in those days it was a lot safer than it would be now. And he sat me down with a map, and he said, when you go to this city, go and see so-and-so. He's the one who got me out of prison there. Now, you see, at that time of year, at that time, it was honorable, it was a badge of honor to be a president because it meant that you were in resistance and doing something wrong. So he would get caught during his travels. And then somebody from the resistance would get him out. Or in one case, somebody in the police in the south of France, he and I visited the station together. One of the policemen turned a blind eye and allowed him to escape. So yes, I shared a bit with my father, but I have to say too that his story was probably not as horribly painful as my mother's was. One thing that neither one of my parents talked about, and it's something that gets lost, that's so sad, is that they didn't tell stories about their parents or their families. I think that's part of what gets lost, is when you have a genocide. My family today, I know this isn't an answer to the question, but I'll just mention it. After the genocide, families tend to get spread out as well. So today, I don't have much family, but the family I have, on my mother's side, a cousin who went into hiding and her family, and they're all in Holland. My father's brother, he came with us to Curacao with two of his children, one of whom is on the line, and then they went out to South America. And they today are spread all over between Argentina, New Zealand, and Europe. So we're spread out, so we didn't grow up together. And so we didn't get the family stories. And I think that's as much of a loss as not actually hearing the stories of the war, if that makes sense. You know, my mother always said, she's, you know, you can read it in a book. And that's perfectly true, you can. But it's not the same thing. Yeah, thank you.
Sure, thanks, Ina. So, and I hope I didn't miss the answer to this next question in what you just listed. Someone else was asking what happened to Ada's brother, Leo.
My mom's brothers, she had two brothers, one younger and one older, didn't make it. One was in hiding in Holland, actually survived the war, but then died shortly afterwards, her younger brother, who was physically impaired. And incidentally, the physically and mentally disabled were also prime targets for the Nazis. You know, it wasn't just the Jews. And my other brother, her other brother, Leo, died, I think, about 5-6 months after arriving in Auschwitz, as did her father.
Okay.
And I don't know if she knew that at the time. I've never asked, and it's too late to ask her now. I forgot to tell you, I'm sorry, this is really important. My mother today is still alive and kicking. She's 93 years old. She's got good days and bad days. But 2 days ago, I was on Skype with her, and she looked all right. She'd even had a haircut. So she's safe.
Good, good. The next question kind of brings your mother's story and your experience with it into the present. And it's kind of a long one, but I'm going to read it all, and you can sort of respond to it in parts if you like. The question was, how has learning and listening to your mother's experience changed the way you live your own life and the way you view the world? What is your advice in terms of standing up to hate today? especially given issues like police brutality or supporting the Black Lives Matter movement. So there's a lot in there, but I guess kind of two parts, you know, how your mom's experience has affected you in general, and then perhaps takeaways for our very current moment.
Well, as I said, good question. As I said earlier, the Holocaust lives in me. I was talking recently to a close friend, you know, saying, gosh, I don't know if I should be telling this story. My mother doesn't understand. And she said, Ina, you've had this in you. You have struggled with this your entire life. You need to tell the story. And my gut feeling is it's all the more necessary today because it's so easy. You see it happening all around us. People are being called names. We'll just leave it at that. It doesn't matter what group it is. Groups are being marginalized. And when groups get marginalized, it happened to the Jews. Bad things happen. That's a really stupid way of saying it, but that's the reality. And what those things are, we can't predict, but it doesn't even matter because what happens is that little by little, it's a propaganda effect. People begin to believe what it is that they're hearing. Even today, I noticed that in the news. I have a degree in political science, and I'm kind of hesitant to read the news because I just don't know what's real and what's not real. There's so much stuff out there, and there's so many political interests and values. As to how this has affected me, I've always known from very early on that this wasn't just something that happened in 1940 something in Holland or Europe. This can happen. You know, Germany was one of the most culturally educated, one of the most cultured places in the world. It was looked up to by everybody. And this happened in Germany. It can happen anywhere. And I've always known that. And it's always made me perhaps a little bit scared and a little bit guarded. And yet, you know, you got to live your life. But I think we have to live it in such a way. I try to live it in such a way that when I hear somebody say something unkind, nasty about another group, I'll stand up and say, sorry, that's not appropriate. I don't want to hear that. And I've done that on occasion where it's really uncomfortable, but I can't sit there and hear it. And I know that my siblings are pretty much the same. And I think we all have to learn to do that because that's where it begins. If you allow it to be said, it will get said again. You know, the Minister of Propaganda, they have a Minister of Propaganda in Germany, they needed one. And he said, as long as, it doesn't matter if it's true or not, as long as you repeat it often enough and loudly enough, people will believe it. And I think we have to be very careful as to what we're listening to and what we're willing to hear from our fellow human beings. I think all of us have a deep desire to be good people. I don't think anybody sets out to become a nasty Nazi or something. But I think it's really easy to get, these things are contagious. You know, the coronavirus that we are slowly maybe coming out of is said to be a very highly contagious virus. I think panic and hate are equally contagious, and we have to watch out for them and ward off against them. I don't know if that answers the questions, but that's what I've got for now.
No, thank you. I think that was all very thoughtful, and I couldn't agree more. We are just about to hit 10:30, so kind of at the end of our hour. I will actually use what you mentioned about propaganda and the news to give a really quick plug for a program that the center is doing tomorrow.
It wasn't planned, I want to tell you that.
Yes, completely coincidental. We're doing a program tomorrow at noon, which is on Zoom or on Facebook Live, about propaganda, news literacy, and interpreting the news media, you know, separating fact from fiction. So I just wanted to alert people to that in case that's of interest. And you can go to our website to find the link for Zoom. There's no registration. You just can click on the Zoom link at noon tomorrow. So thanks, Ina, for providing such an excellent segue.
Thank you.
And I thank you again for just sharing the story of your mom's, that every time I'm just kind of awed by her resilience. And I thank Roosevelt students for being such a good audience and the great questions, and to Carolyn for working with us to get this set up. So I think with that, we'll finish up here. I'm actually gonna put in the chat a survey that we'd love for you to fill out, because we're just, starting this Zoom speaker thing in the last couple weeks, and we would love your feedback on how it went for you attendees. Carolyn, unless you have anything else to say to your students, we can end the meeting. And I thank you all again.
Thank you, Ina, very much.
Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you to your students. I didn't get a chance to look at them, which normally I would have, because honestly, this Zoom thing has me a little frazzled, so I wasn't able to look around and see people. I wanted to, because I wanted to see your faces, and I also wanted to see some of my relatives who are on, and some of my family friends. But I think you guys were a great audience, and thank you for giving me this opportunity.
All right, have a great rest of the day, everybody.